Our final speaker, who will be delivering the concluding remarks of the 14th Geneva Summit United Nations opening, is Rosa Maria Payá. She's been a longtime friend of the Geneva Summit for Human Rights and spoken numerous times before. She is a Cuban pro-democracy activist, civil society campaigner, I would say one of the most well-known representatives of her people who are trying to free her people. She works to promote international solidarity with Cuba, seeks justice for her father, Oswaldo Payá, who received the European Parliament's prestigious Sakharov Prize, was a 5-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee who was assassinated 10 years ago, and we've never had justice for the case of her father. She coordinates Cuba Decide, advocates for the Cuban government to hold a binding referendum for free and fair elections. She's president of the Latin American Network of Young People for Democracy. Rosa has appeared before the United Nations Human Rights Council upstairs, speaking often for UNWatch. She's been interrupted numerous times by the Cuban government and their allies, but she persists. She's spoken at the European Parliament, the US Senate, Organization of American States, Summit of the Americas, and many national parliaments. In 2019, Rosa Maria Payá received UNWatch's Morris Abram Award for her courageous defense of freedom, liberal democracy, and universal human rights. I would say that her mission to free the Cuban people from dictatorship has never been more vital. Rosa Maria.
Thank you so much, Hillel. It's, as always, an honor to be here with you and with so many human rights defenders, so needed voices in the face of the evil. As you mentioned, next July 22nd will mark 10 years since my father, Oswaldo Payá, prominent Cuban opposition leader, was assassinated by the Cuban communist regime. In 2013, Ban Ki-moon, the UN General Secretary at that time, received and circulated a petition to create an international committee in order to conduct an independent investigation into the killing of my father. That investigation is yet to be conducted. In contrast, the Cuban regime sits in the Human Rights Council, from where they protect their impunity, making sure that the multiple accusations against them or against the rest of their criminal friends, I mean Venezuela, China, Russia, Iran, etc., do not prosper. All of these regimes act in gangs, conspiring together to cover their backs and empty the mission of the Human Rights Council of content and effectiveness. So we can only hope that the soon-to-be the expulsion of Russia from the Human Rights Council be followed by the expulsion of Cuba and the rest of the currently seated dictatorships upstairs. We all know the long criminal friendship history between the Castro brothers and Russia. We all remember the role that the Cuban regime played during the Cold War. For some decades, the world thought that these ties were no longer a threat. However, now we are seeing the deepening of the military and strategic agreement signed by Cuba's and Russia's regime. In last December 2021, Russia threatened a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On January 13, 2022, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov repeated the threat, telling in Russian TV, and I'm quoting, that he could neither confirm nor exclude sending military assets to Cuba. On February 2022, just days before Russia's invasion, the Speaker of the Russian Congress arrived in Cuba and thanked Cuba for supporting Russia's decision on Donetsk and Luhansk. After, Russia forgave for 5 years the $2.2 billion debt that the Cuban regime has with Russia. Actually, the Americas has paid a high price for tolerating a communist dictatorship in Cuba. It has caused the end of the democracy in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and caused the largest refugee crisis in our region. The regime threatens peace and security of the continent and is systematically provoking migratory crisis. It is involved in the Russian sonic attacks against American diplomats, initially called the Havana Syndrome, and in many other sorts of criminal-related activities, from trafficking persons to providing sanctuary and support to terrorists. The Cuban regime is the Berlin Wall of our time. But to turn it down, the Cuban people need the support of the international community. For 63 years, Cuba has been held hostage of an oppressive dictatorship that denies in law and in practice the most basic human rights of its own people. After more than 6 decades without free, fair, or multi-party elections in Cuba, Cuba is in crisis. According to the Hanke Misery Index of 2021, Cuba is the most miserable country in the world, driven by a soaring inflation rate, shortages of basic products, and tens of thousands of people have abandoned the country in the last 5 months. But in the chamber upstairs, they say that Cuba is some beacon for social justice where everybody is equal, when the truth is that the Cuban military elite have sat fat while the Cuban people starves. While the truth is that that commercial tourist paradise is a prison for the Cuban people. But the Cuban people have said enough. And last July, hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the streets in peaceful nationwide protests, chanting freedom, down with the dictatorship, change of system, patria y vida, which is motherland and life, and is the opposite of what the communist regime propagate, which is motherland or dead. The popular demand for a democratic opening is clear, as it is the only way to ensure respect for human rights and the rule of law. But the regime response included calling for a civil war to defend the revolution, brutal arrests, torture, sham trials, and sentences for up to 30 years. Currently, the regime holds more than 1,000 political prisoners, mostly peaceful protesters, many under the age of 18, children as young as 16 and 17 years old being condemned up to 18 years in prison. Our movement, Cuba Decide, is a national and global initiative to force the Cuban regime to submit to the will of the people and leave. This can only be achieved by citizen mobilization and international pressure, and that is what we work for. But activists on the island fight in the most disadvantageous conditions possible, and it is imperative that all of the nations of the free world support the Cuban people's fight for a change, because the victory of the democracy in Cuba is essential to open the path to peace, prosperity, and stability in the whole hemisphere. It seems that the world has been sleeping while the Chinese Communist Party tries to exterminate Uyghurs. The Taliban regime takes over Afghanistan. The Putin and Iranian regime kills dissidents, and Venezuelan and Nicaraguan dictatorship torture political prisoners, following the Cuban State Security's handbook. In the face of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is maybe awakening, maybe, to the great threat behind the illusion of peace and stability that Western democracies have lived in the past half a century. The great Edmund Burke alerted us. He said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for the good men to do nothing. I believe that in the aftermath of the Bucha genocide, we should all understand, and especially the Western democracies, and especially the democratic nations united in this House, we should all understand that when in the face of evil you do nothing, you cannot be longer considered a good man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosa, for your powerful concluding remarks.